Olá, boa tarde a todos de novo. Esperamos que estejam a gostar desta tarde de palestras. Já tivemos aqui temas diversos. Voltamos agora à comunicação. Nós temos agora um tema que se chama a ciência da advocacia animal, usando os dados para ganhar a mudança de forma mais eficaz. Lá está, fala-se muito sobre estas coisas, porquê? Porque de facto, eu não me canso de dizer isto, nós temos a melhor mensagem do mundo para passar e resta-nos agora aprender, tornar-nos artistas na forma de passar esta mensagem, porque de resto nós temos tudo. Então, eu convidei o Nick Cooney, que é um ativista que conheço já há alguns anos, cujo trabalho me impressionou bastante e é um orgulho, ele não me está a entender, portanto não está a receber os elogios, mas para mim é um orgulho muito grande e uma alegria muito grande tê-lo connosco, porque o Nick já há muitos anos que não está a dar palestras, porque está mergulhado noutro tipo de trabalhos bastante sérios, e abriu uma exceção para falar connosco aqui no Veganário sobre um tema que também lhe é muito caro e sobre o qual ele já falava quase há 10 anos atrás. Então, atualmente, o Nick é sócio-gerente de uma organização que se chama Lever, de alavanca, um fundo de capital de risco que investe em empresas de laticínios e carnes vegetais, portanto, de substitutos, mas também de carne limpa, tanto na Europa, na Ásia, como nos Estados Unidos, mas com foco na Ásia, que é onde os animais para já vão precisar de mais ajuda no futuro, onde o consumo de carne sabemos que se projeta, vai aumentar. É também diretor da Lever Foundation, que é uma organização, neste caso sem fins lucrativos, que trabalha para proteger os animais utilizados na pecuária, também na região da Grande China e em toda a Ásia. Anteriormente, portanto, o Nick sendo um ativista de longa data, ele começou o ativismo como todos nós, por onde se começa, mas depois passou a ser o vice-presidente e foi durante muitos anos da Mercy for Animals, internacional, que já é, penso que, conhecida de todos, e é o fundador da Humane League, precisamente a organização onde o John Oberg trabalhou e ajudou a aumentar o nível de seguidores tremendamente. A Humane League, que já tem mais de 1 milhão de seguidores e que trabalha também na sensibilização da população de forma pragmática sobre a utilização dos animais para comida, é uma das organizações que está já há alguns anos classificada como uma organização de alto impacto pela Animal Charity Evaluators. Quem não conhece, também é uma organização com um trabalho bastante sério e que faz precisamente esta investigação para saber que organizações é que têm grande impacto para que nós nos possamos inspirar também nesse trabalho. É também um dos cofundadores do The Good Food Institute, que é outra das organizações que representou uma pequena grande revolução no veganismo, porque eles trabalham com cientistas, com investigadores e empresários para criar alternativas vegetais à carne, ao peixe, portanto, alternativas à proteína animal, de alta qualidade, mas acima de tudo extremamente saborosas, porque é o que as pessoas querem saber. E também à carne, podemos chamar a carne limpa, carne cultivada, que também tem um papel muito importante, terá e tem, na evolução do veganismo. Pronto, eu fiz questão de fazer esta apresentação um bocadinho mais longa, porque para além de ser interessante conhecerem, agora podem pesquisar, eu até posso partilhar depois no evento, estas organizações de alto impacto, ficam também a partilhar a minha alegria de termos uma pessoa com tamanha experiência a honrar o nosso festival. Ele é também autor de vários livros, Change of Hearts, Veganomics e How to be Great at Doing Good. O Veganomics é um livro que também mexeu bastante com o tipo de ativismo que pratico já há uns anos e está relacionado com esta palestra de hoje, porque o Nick fez um trabalho muito grande de pesquisa, de estudos, de dados científicos, de estudos pagos, precisamente pelas empresas, milhares de dólares que a causa não tem para saber como é que a sociedade funciona, e que ele fez, importou esses conhecimentos de outras áreas para a causa. E dessa forma, então, a causa foi revolucionada porque durante muitos anos, décadas, o ativismo, e ainda hoje é assim, era visto como uma forma espontânea de arte subjetiva que cada um faz à sua maneira. E nós sabemos que isso pode funcionar, mas também pode não funcionar. Então, a única proposta que nos faz é transformar essa arte numa ciência. Então, em vez de nos apresentarmos ao público com uma ideia, que é o que eu acho, a minha opinião, utilizar dados, motivos, objetivos, que dessa forma acabam por ser incontestáveis. Agora sim, sem mais delongas, Nick, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for accepting exceptionally to make this talk in our festival. I have done a long presentation of you because you just deserve it. You work too hard and it's an amazing work. So I told people about your team, and just let me tell people, because I forgot that now in Portuguese. Para quem nos está a ver, peço imensa desculpa, eu começo a falar em inglês e depois isto aqui muda o chip da língua. Quem nos estiver a ver em direto no Facebook, porque quem já está na sala, penso que já sabe, a sala tem estado sempre aberta, nós temos tido a possibilidade de tradução simultânea. Temos connosco o Rui Silva, que se prontificou a fazer este trabalho gratuitamente, ofereceu este trabalho também ao veganário, que é isso que o veganário é, uma reunião de trabalho de muita gente. E o Rui, durante todo o fim de semana, as palestras que são em inglês, ele está aqui e traduz em simultâneo. Portanto, como é que fazem? Quem estiver no Facebook e quiser ouvir em português, entra na sala Zoom e em baixo encontram um símbolozinho do mundo, onde podem escolher o canal da língua que querem ouvir. Se puserem em inglês, ouvem o Nick, a versão original. Se se sentirem mais confortáveis a ouvir em português, mudam então para o canal de português. Pronto, não sei se me esqueci de alguma coisa, mas agora sim, sem mais longas, muito obrigada a todos. Thank you so much, Nick. I won't waste any more time.
Well, thank you, Elisa. Really a privilege to be here, and thank you very much for having me. And more importantly, thank you for putting on this conference and all the work that you and the organization do to advocate smartly and strategically for farm animals. So I will share my screen here and jump right into it. So as Elisa mentioned, I'm going to speak today about the science of animal advocacy, turning what has, as Elisa noted, often been viewed as a sort of subjective question of how we should go about advocating for animals and plant-based eating. What are the more effective ways or less effective ways to go about that? Turning that from a more subjective question to an objective question, taking a more scientific, data-based approach to that work. So to dive right into that. So over 800 years ago, a practice known as alchemy got its start. So this was a proto-science process where individuals, researchers would, basically their goal was to turn certain elements into others. The most famous and classic example is attempts to turn lead into gold, but certainly there was many other things that the alchemists attempted as well. And while we might look back now and kind of laugh at this and view it as silly, at the time, it was taken very seriously. There were university courses on the subject, textbooks. It was very highly regarded for many hundreds of years. Then in around the 1600s, chemistry came along. And so similar to alchemy, what chemistry was attempting to do, what the science of chemistry was attempting to do, is understand the basic physical elemental building blocks of the world around us, and understand how these elements work and interact with one another and with the world. But whereas alchemy in its hundreds of years in practice generated essentially nothing of value, either for our collective knowledge or more importantly for life in general, chemistry in just the past couple hundred years has generated all sorts of magnificent, significant improvements in our lives. For example, if you enjoy having access to medications, life-saving medications in some cases, if you enjoy your cell phone and what's all the things you get to do with that, if you enjoy having clean drinking water reliably coming out of your tap and your faucet every day, and if you like getting to ride around in a car with your friends, you can thank chemistry in part for all of those things and so much more. So I guess the question is, given that both were working to understand these basic physical elements in our world and how they interact and how to use them, what is the difference? Why did chemistry succeed where alchemy failed? Well, the difference is the scientific method, something that I imagine all of us learned back when we were in grade school. Whereas alchemy was truly more of an art where there were philosophies and theories about why one approach might lead to a certain outcome or another approach a different outcome. What chemistry did is it incorporated the scientific method, which of course has those couple key components of coming up with a hypothesis, doing a research experiment that will either prove or disprove that hypothesis, looking at the results to draw conclusions, and then repeating over and over again to get reliable factual information based on measurement, observation, and measurement about what's going on. So science, at the heart of it, science builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions. That's the dictionary definition, and that's also truly what science is. At the heart, science is testing. It's testing to get objective data and then basing our knowledge and building our knowledge on that data, that provable data. The science, though, in testing specifically, isn't just confined to things like chemistry or biology. Testing is used, and the scientific approach is used in all sorts of areas of society. So for example, major companies that are trying to sell products, be they automobiles or anything else, will often use data and research and testing to figure out which audiences to target, which type of advertising to use, and other things about what to sell and how to sell it in order to make more money. Testing has also been used in other charitable sectors as well. For example, one of the major public health issues in certain parts of the world, including Latin America and Africa, is malaria, which still kills a huge number of people each year and typically is contracted through mosquitoes. And so there's a number of charitable organizations that try to get things like you see in this image, bed nets, to people so that when they go to sleep at night, they can sleep inside the bed net and prevent mosquitoes from pricking them and potentially infecting them with malaria. But there were differences of opinion between different charities doing this work about what is the most effective way. So some charities felt that they should just give the bed nets away for free, so everyone had one, and it was the right for people to have one. Other charities, though, looked at the fact that some people would receive a bed net but not use it, and felt that, okay, maybe what we should do is charge a very, very small amount, like the equivalent of, say 50 US cents, half a euro, so that people, even though everyone can afford it, it will make them feel like they've put something towards it, they're more invested in it, and therefore they would be more likely to use it. So these were two different beliefs about what approach would be best. You could think of good arguments and reasons for either side to be correct, but no one really knew until one entity and then another decided to actually put this to the test, where they ran a controlled scientific experiment. Some people got the bed nets for free, others had to pay this small price to have them, and then they compared the results to see how each approach actually affected rates of malaria among those people. And for what it's worth, what they found is that giving the nets away for free actually did a bit more to reduce the spread of malaria. Some of this research and a lot of this work has been funded by Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft and the Gates Foundation. And he himself, Bill Gates, has frequently spoken out about the value and importance of this testing. For example, he says, "I have been struck again and again about how important measurement is to improving the human condition." And while that's certainly true for the human condition, the same holds true for the condition and situation that animals, including farm animals, find themselves in, and how we can make a better world for them. Just as scientific research, testing, and data has allowed those in the for-profit world and other charitable sectors to make more efficient decisions and get the outcomes that they're working towards and desiring more effectively, the same holds true for those of us who are working to help animals and want to create a world with less animal suffering. For example, just a few examples, when we're thinking about, and I'll use examples from the farm animal space and from the space of promoting plant-based eating. For example, when we're doing that, when we are trying to advocate for plant-based eating and for people to change their behavior in a way that helps farm animals, is it more effective to use stories talking about individual animals? Or is it more effective to use statistics to show how big the problem is? Is it more effective to use a message like go vegan or the equivalent? Or is it more effective to use a message such as encouraging meat reduction? One last example, this is a bit of some outdated images, but if we're using printed literature to try to encourage others to make a change, There's lots of different pieces out there. There's lots of different ways you could construct a booklet or a video or any other piece of information. Which of the different approaches should we take and why? To date, all of these have been viewed, largely, for many years, all of these were viewed as something that one might have a philosophy or theory around, might have opinions and arguments and reasons to support those opinions. But there hadn't always been the sense that we can do research and gather data to determine what the factual answer to these questions are. These are ultimately not questions of opinion or theory, these are questions of fact. And they can be proven, or a particular opinion about this could be proven or disproven based on that research. Let me give you an example from a different field, the field of environmental conservation. So there were some researchers, this particular study was done in the US, and they wanted to see how they could get homeowners to reduce the amount of energy they were using in their homes. Obviously, this would be beneficial to the environment. So what they did is they created 4 different types of flyers. And they went around to homes in one particular neighborhood, and they left just one of these 4 flyers at each home. So one flyer talked about the environmental reasons to conserve energy. A second talked about how if you used less energy, you could save money. A third talked about how conserving energy benefited the whole community and the people in your neighborhood. And the fourth noted that many other people in the neighborhood were already conserving energy. So the researchers left just one of these at each home, and then they worked with a local utility company to monitor the actual energy usage in these homes over the next 3 months. And it turned out that of these 4 flyers, 3 of them had essentially no detectable impact on actual energy usage in these homes. But one of them did. One of them did actually get people to reduce their energy usage. So maybe you might ask yourself for a second which one you think was most effective. It turned out that the only one of these 4 flyers that had any impact was the 4th one, the one that simply noted that other people in that town were already reducing their own energy usage, which tells us 2 things. First, it tells us that even if the motivation of these researchers may have been environmental conservation, even if their ultimate goal is to protect the environment, it doesn't mean that that is the message that's going to be most effective at achieving the real world outcome that they want to achieve. The second thing, and the broader message we can take from this, is that is the importance of research and testing. Obviously, we're doing this over Zoom. When I've given this talk in person in the past, I'll usually poll the audience to see which one they think is most effective. And typically, maybe 35–40% get it right, and the rest get it wrong. And I think it's quite clear from that for many of us, our opinions and guesses about which approach will be better, they'll be wrong a lot of the time. And so this is the value of turning to testing. So not making decisions when it comes to advocacy based on philosophy or guesses or assumptions, but actually looking at data to figure out what works and what works best towards achieving those actual real world outcomes that we want to bring about in the world to help animals. At the heart of it, advocacy really comes down to, in most cases, changing human behavior, getting individual people to make different decisions in their own lives, and also for those who are in more higher decision-making levels, be it in the government or companies or so on, getting them to change their behavior and change their internal policies. And if we want to be effective at changing human behavior, we have to really think about how does one succeed at that. There's things that advocates for causes, including the animal advocacy cause, sometimes tell themselves that sound good and that can feel good, but that are not necessarily true. For example, sometimes we'll tell themselves that we will succeed because we're on the side of compassion, or we'll succeed because we really, really care about animals and about making this progress. Or maybe we'll succeed if we just work very, very hard. Certainly, all of these things can be helpful in achieving the outcomes you want and succeeding, but these things alone do not guarantee success by any stretch of the imagination. I think the answer is, the reality is we'll succeed if we figure out and we use what really motivates people to change in our messaging and in our approaches in general. So I think we really have two options. We can be like the alchemists, where we can base our advocacy decisions, our messaging decisions, our programmatic decisions on philosophies and theories and ideas about what should work without working off data and scientific testing, or we can take that latter approach. We can go more the direction that chemists and chemistry took, where we make decisions we make based on observable data and the factual conclusions we can draw from data, from research, and from scientific testing. Now, the good thing for us as advocates is that there are already thousands and thousands and thousands of published, peer-reviewed academic studies and other studies showing what works better and what doesn't work as well for changing human behavior in all sorts of areas, including many of the areas that we address. Now, I know sitting and reading through dry academic studies might not be your idea of a fun Friday night. In fact, it may sound a little intimidating. So what I tried to do in years past is look through and read as many of these studies that were relevant as possible and compile some of the lessons we can learn from those into a few books that summarize those data points. So one was called Change of Hearts, What Psychology Can Teach Us About Spreading Social Change. And the second was Veganomics, the surprising science on vegetarians. So what I'm going to do today in the rest of this talk is I'm going to talk through some data that we have on behavior change and studies that we can draw from to be more effective advocates. And then also look at some data specific to plant-based eating and how we can use that data and what it tells us to be more effective advocates in that area as well. So let's get into this. So one persuasion tool we can use comes around this area of this question of using stories versus using statistics, like we touched on a bit earlier. Let's say we're trying to promote compassion for farm animals, and more specifically, we're trying to encourage people to shift away from meat consumption towards plant-based eating. And in that situation, which of these two approaches do you think would be more effective? Telling a story about an individual pig and what life is like for him or her, or giving statistical information to show how broad the problem is? For example, that 112 million pigs suffer on factory farms each year in the US, where I'm from. So this is a question that, if we think about it now, probably most of us can guess which of these is going to be more the effective approach, but it's one that maybe we hadn't thought of before. And it's one where, like in many other areas, science and research and data can inform what the best approach is. An example of that from the non-animal advocacy space, but rather the human welfare, human protection space, there was a study done where the researchers wanted to figure out how they could get people to give more money to charity, specifically to charitable causes working to alleviate hunger and malnutrition in Africa. And so what the researchers in this study did is they came up with 3 different fundraising letters, and they mailed one of those letters to a certain bunch of people, second to a second bunch, and the third to a third bunch, to see which actually generated the greatest amount of donations. So the first letter focused on how big the problem was, the number of millions of people who starve to death each year, the even larger number of people who struggle with malnutrition and being underfed, and so on. The second letter didn't have any of that broader information. It just told the story of one young child and what life was like for her as someone facing starvation. And the third letter combined elements of both. So it had the story about the young girl and what life was like for her, but it also gave that big picture look at the number of people facing these issues. So these letters went out, the donations came back in, and at the end of the day, which one do you think ended up raising the most money to actually fight this issue? Well, it turned out that the second letter, the one that only had the story, generated far more donations than the other two. In fact, it generated about twice as much in money as the statistics-focused letter. And the third letter, the one that combined both the story and the stats, did only very slightly better than the stats-only letter. Another example of this, and another example of the power of stories in action, there were a team of researchers who worked at a university, and they had students at the university design and give a 5-minute speech about whatever topic they wanted. At the end of the class, they polled the students to see what they remembered from one another's presentations. And what they found is that of the statistics that were presented in the student presentations, only 5 to 10% of those were remembered. But of the stories that were told, over 50% of those were remembered by other students in the class. The stories are inherently sticky. We remember them, and focusing on individuals is also something that seems to generate more of an empathetic, compassionate response. So how can we take this research that exists and has been shown in a great number of studies and apply it to advocacy for farm animals? Well, I think the clear answer to that is that when we're trying to get people to care about farm animals, to change their diet in an animal-friendly way, focusing on individuals, individual animals, of course, and telling stories about those individuals is probably going to be much more effective than trying to explain how big the problem is, the millions of animals that suffer, how long they suffer, and those sort of things. All right, next tool and next area I want to talk about is the best request. We all want the most that we can get out of life, right? The most success, pleasure, happiness, impact, meaning, I mean, all of those good things. And the same is true when it comes to advocacy. We want other people and we want the world to change as much as possible in the direction that we would like to change it. But there's a question when we're thinking about impact. How much should we ask for? So for example, let's say I'm giving a presentation to a classroom of students, and ideally I would want them to all eat vegan. I'd want them to all become full-time animal advocates, or at least making money to donate to animal advocacy. I'd want them to make all these other changes that would be beneficial for the environment and society. So do I encourage all the students in the class to make all of these changes, do all of these things that I think are the right and ethical thing to do? Or do I ask for something much smaller, something much, much easier that they're much more likely to be open to and be willing to do? Well, this is a question, this general question of what is the best request, how much to ask for, a lot, a little, or something in between. This is a question that researchers too have thought about and looked at and done a number of studies on. And the largest meta-analysis that looked at the various studies done on this issue and tried to combine the results to draw conclusions, they found that the efficacy follows a sort of curve. And this is what the curve looks like. If we ask for a whole lot, and if we ask for so much, something that is hard for most people to picture themselves doing, we're not going to achieve very much change, because most people think it's not of interest to them, they can't do it, and so they don't do it. Similarly, if we ask for something small, very easy, but very small, yes, a number of people may make the change, but because it's a very small change, it doesn't ultimately add up to a lot of that desired behavioral change outcome that we're seeking. The sweet spot, the type of request that generates the most real-world behavior change, is encouraging people to make a change that is significant, but that they could, at least many people could, picture themselves doing. So now when we think about this chart and we think about something like plant-based eating, how do we think about that, right? So what is a request that falls into that sweet spot of something that is a sizable change, but that at least a good number of people could picture themselves doing? I imagine that for most people, the idea of eating vegan all the time is not something they could picture themselves doing. I also imagine that something like maybe having one plant-based meal a month is something that certainly anyone could do, but is probably on the too easy end of the spectrum. So I think it's probably something in the middle of those two areas that would fall on this highlighted high point of the behavior change spectrum. A change that is significant, that has a real impact, but that many people at least could probably picture themselves doing. Meat reduction, for example, maybe in many countries, the request and the desired behavior change that falls in that sweet spot in terms of making the best request. Again, the request that gets the greatest amounts of that real world behavior change that is being sought after. We'll come back to this a bit later. A third tool I want to touch on is social norms. So we looked at this earlier, and the reality is we like to think of ourselves, many of us like to think of ourselves as individuals who do what we do, who have the beliefs we have because we've thought about them, we've sort of independently assessed them, and we've decided that this is who we are, this is what we believe, and this is what we are going to do. But at heart, we are all copycats. We learn by copying others, either others in general, or at least others in our social and peer group about what to do, what to think, and how to do it. And the same holds true when it comes to ethical related behaviors. So as mentioned, we saw this earlier in that study of energy usage, where self-interest and social interest and environmental interests are concerned. None of those things had power to change behavior, but a social norm of what other people are doing, that did inspire actual behavior change. And there's many, many other studies that have been done documenting the same sort of effect. So let me give just one other example. There was a hotel chain that wanted their guests to start reusing bath towels. And for the hotel, there were financial reasons for them to want this, because the more that guests reuse the bath towels, the less laundry had to be done, so the less electricity, less water, less staff time. It would save them money. But of course, it would also be good for the environment for people to reuse their bath towels. And so what the hotel did is they put a little sign in each room in the hotel, encouraging guests to please reuse your bath towel to help us protect the environment. And the signs did have an impact. They did get a number of people to start reusing towels. But researchers came in and they thought they could do a better job. And so what they did is they worked with the hotel and they took out all those old signs and they put in new little signs that simply said, most guests in this hotel reuse their bath towels. Nothing about the environment, just a social norms message. And switching from the environment to the social norms message increased towel reuse by over 25%. And in fact, when these signs were made even more specific, so they said most guests in room 309, or whatever the room was, reuse their towels, towel reuse increased further still. And this impact of social norms messages has been shown time and again. Just in the environmental area, there's studies showing increases water conservation, energy conservation, preventing littering, recycling, and so on. And it has also been shown in many other areas of human behavior as well. So when we think about promoting plant-based eating, how can we apply this research, this reality of human behavior to our work? So clearly in every society in the world, those who are vegan or even vegetarian represent a small minority. So we can't say that the majority of people are doing that. But we can look at things that suggest plant-based eating is a large, sizable, and growing trend. There's an increasing number of people or a significant number of people who support this. So, for example, we can point about how quickly those numbers are growing. We can point to famous mainstream celebrities and other public figures that have made that switch to demonstrate a social norm. We can also talk about the results of surveys that show, for example, in many countries in Europe and North America, studies often show 30 to 40% of the public saying they plan to eat less meat and more plant-based foods this year. That's not the reality, but that's what people tend to report on surveys, whether or not they follow through. So those are examples of good sorts of social norm data points and examples that we can point to better persuade others to make this change. And when we're doing advocacy, when we're speaking to others about this issue, those sort of social norms, we can tell from the research, could be more effective than speaking specifically about animal protection or other things. All right, the next tool I want to talk about is be like them. So related to and similar to and intertwined with the social norms message and the impact of social norms messaging is this fact. We are much more likely to be persuaded to change our opinion and behavior about something when we are encouraged to do so by somebody who we view as being like us. So this has been documented in many different studies. People who are politically liberal or are more likely to be persuaded on a non-political topic by somebody who is politically liberal than they would be by someone who is politically conservative. Men are more effective at persuading men, women are more effective at persuading women, older people are persuading older people, younger, and so on and so forth. Even when you get into things like smoking habits, religious beliefs or lack thereof, any things that show or seem to show some sort of external or internal similarity, the more those similarities are there, the more likely persuasion is to occur. So what does that mean for us as animal advocates? I think what it means is that we need to pay attention to our audience and we need to tailor our presentation, our messaging, and what parts of ourselves we bring to the table in those interactions. The more that we seem similar to the person or group that we're speaking with or communicating to, the more likely they are to listen, to absorb the message, and to make a change in their lives. And so the way we might present ourselves, whether that's physically, the things we talk about ourselves, the way we talk in general, might be quite different at, say, a political convention versus if we were doing similar work at an outdoor music festival. The more we tailor ourselves to our audience, the more effective we will be. One additional tool I want to touch on is show them how. So when we think about advocacy for farm animals and encouraging people to move towards plant-based eating, animal advocates spend a lot of time talking about why people should do this. The whys around animals, the whys around health, the whys around the environment and other areas. But not nearly as much time is spent on showing people how to make these changes. And I think it's understandable that many advocates would have this approach. I think it's because for those of us who have been doing something, some certain behavior for many years, it becomes easy. It feels second nature. It feels this is super easy. Anyone could do this. I don't really need to explain how to do it. And we forget that something that seems easy to us because we've been doing it for so long can seem next to impossible for someone who has never done that same behavior before. But if we look at the research, it shows that these questions around how and getting people to understand how to make a change are actually even more important than the reasons why. So the largest meta-analysis on this looked at nearly 250 studies around human health behavioral interventions, basically studies that were done, experiments that were done to try to get people to behave in a more healthy way. This included all sorts of behaviors like not smoking, exercising, eating more healthy, and so on and so forth. And so the meta-analysis looked at all these studies and looked at what had the biggest impact. And what it found is that even when people understood why they should make a change, and even when they agreed with the why message that it was a good thing to do, they were still not very likely to actually make a change. The single factor that made the biggest impact and was the biggest determining factor in whether or not they actually changed the behavior was their sense of that how question, whether they felt they knew how to make the behavior change that was being suggested. Them feeling like they knew how was more likely to cause them to actually change their behavior than them knowing why and even believing the whys about that behavior change. And so what I think that means for us as animal advocates is, sure, we can and should let people know about the benefits, the whys of these sort of changes. But it's just as important and probably even more important to focus time and energy on the how to actually make these changes that we would like people to make. And let me jump from there into some data points on vegetarians, vegans, and people who are semi-vegetarians, meat reducers, for two reasons. First, this will tie into that last question of helping people understand how to make these changes, but also further gets to the general thesis of what I'm talking about, which is that in thinking about how to do this advocacy, looking at the data points that do exist and that we can gather on people who eat plant-based and those who don't, and why not, the more we can look to those data points, the more effective decisions we will be able to make as advocates, and the more effective our future advocacy will be able to be. So let's look at some of the data that does exist on people, on these sort of folks. So first, what are the barriers to vegetarian and vegan eating? And I use the word vegetarian in many of these slides because most of the research done has been done on vegetarians, which researchers typically group both vegetarians and vegans into the same category they call vegetarians. There's a lot less research on people who are just vegan. So that's why I'm using vegetarian in many of these slides, because that's what the data speaks to. So what are the barriers to vegetarian and vegan eating? What's keeping people from making these dietary choices? So study after study has shown there's really 4 big barriers. And by far the biggest barrier is taste. People think about things like tofu shown here and other plant-based products, and they think that they don't taste good, or they miss giving up the tastes of meat and dairy products that they know and love and don't want to give them up. So taste in survey after survey is the #1 barrier in why people don't shift towards vegetarian or vegan eating. A second significant barrier is health concerns. Now, this has been shifting some in public opinion, but there still is a good number of people who think that if they were to eat plant-based, it would harm their health. It wouldn't be very healthy for them. So that's another barrier that they perceive. And certainly, I'm sure all of us have gotten that question of where do you get your protein from many times. A third barrier is a perceived barrier is convenience. People feel that if they give up meat, it won't be convenient, it won't be easy to find food, or it won't be easy to prepare the food. And fourth and finally, social concerns. People worry that if they go vegetarian, go vegan, it'll be more difficult to go to social events, to go out to dinner with friends, work dinners, those sort of things. And so that could cause some awkwardness and inconvenience around social issues as well. And all these areas, taste, health, convenience, social issues, these are not just barriers that prevent people from moving towards vegetarian and vegan eating. There are also challenges that cause people to move away from vegetarian or vegan after they've made that switch. So a number of studies from both Europe and North America have found that for every 4 people who go vegetarian or go vegan, 3 out of 4 of them will go back to eating meat in the future, and usually not that far in the future, a few years in the future. And it's typically these exact same stumbling blocks that cause people to go back. It's not because their beliefs about the why change, about that it's good to eat plant-based or more ethical or so on. It's really these how barriers, these sort of barriers that cause them to go back. So the more we can address these 4 barriers around taste, around health, inconvenience, and social issues, the more we can address these with other people, the more likely they will be to move towards plant-based eating, and the more likely they will be to stick with plant-based eating as well. Another question that's worth asking is who is vegetarian or vegan? What sorts of people in the public are more likely to make or have made this dietary switch? And the reason it's beneficial to ask this question is for exactly the same reason that advertisers for any product or political party or any other issue like to know who their base is or who's more likely to be responsive to their messaging. The more we know what types of people are more likely to be responsive to the messaging, the more effective we can be at spending our very limited money and time and resources focused on the people who are more likely to change rather than the public as a whole, or worst of all, those who are least likely to change. So what does the data show on this? So a few things. First, people who are vegetarian or vegan definitely skew very heavily female. They definitely skew much more heavily younger, on the younger side of things. They tend to be more politically liberal. They tend to be more educated and intelligent. They tend to be a bit more single, a bit more than the general population. And they also tend to be less religious. There's some other things that we see, but these are some of the larger categories. And so with this, what we can draw from this as animal advocates is just as if we think back to that Lexus example, a car company, or right now it's election season in the US here, and just as any folks that are trying to impact decisions, buying decisions, voting decisions, other social decisions, will try to target the audiences that are most likely to be interested. Given, again, that limited time and money we have, the more we target people in these demographic groups, these overlapping demographic groups, the higher success rate we are likely to have at persuading people to make these changes. Another thing that's worth looking at is why do people go vegetarian and go vegan? What's the reason for making this change? And so if we look at studies of people who have gone entirely vegetarian or entirely vegan, we see 2 main reasons: health and animals. And the individual studies vary a lot, but if we look at the studies overall, these 2 seem more or less neck and neck and tied as the 2 primary motivations that people have. For many people, it's just health. For many people, it's just animals. For some people, it's both. But those are clearly the 2 main driving forces. Much further down would be things like taste, religion, environment, and other issues. So it's really health and animals that's driving most people who have decided to go vegetarian or go vegan. So what does that mean for us as advocates? It probably means that to the extent we're talking about a why message for making shifts in diet, for this audience, if that's our goal, is to get people to entirely make that change, we probably want to focus more on the animals and health side of things rather than other messages. However, if we look at those who are semi-vegetarian, people who are reducing the amount of meat that they're eating, the results look quite different. And it should be noted that for all of the diet changes that have reduced the number of animals raised in factory farms. The vast majority of that shift that reduced the number of animals in factory farms has come not from the vegetarians or vegans, rather it's come from people who have reduced their meat consumption. They may not make as much change per person, but because they're a much larger group, ultimately there are far more animals being spared right now as a result of the larger number of people who are reducing meat consumption than there are the number of animals spared from suffering on factory farms as a result of the smaller number of people that have cut out animal products entirely. And so this is an important group of consumers, an important group of the public to be paying attention to. And for this group, there's no contest. Health is by far the predominant driving motivation for people who are eating less meat and more plant-based foods. Nothing comes close, including other ethical issues like animals or the environment. It's nearly all for health motivated reasons, at least as the primary motivation for cutting back on meat products. So what does this mean? What does all of this mean for us as animal advocates? Well, I think it means that when we are deciding how to speak about these issues, how to message things, we should keep in mind that for those who go fully vegetarian or vegan, health and animals are the primary motivator. And for that large group of people who are cutting back on meat, that are ultimately reducing a lot of animal suffering, it is that health motivation that is the driving dominant factor. And so as much as you and I may care about animals and may be motivated primarily by reducing animal suffering and the ethics around that, having a very strong health message seems to be one of the most effective ways at speaking to what actually matters to the public and getting them to make the behavior change that we would like them to make. One last thing to touch on in terms of the impact of diet change, because this is another set of data points that I think is very important for us to keep in mind in thinking about these issues. I think all of us would agree that all animals matter. We want to spare as many of these individuals as possible from a life of suffering. But if we truly believe that all animals matter equally, that a pig and a chicken and a dog all have equal value and equal worth, then it probably makes sense to look specifically at what is the impact that happens for animals when people change their diet. So these icons represent the animals impacted by the average American diet. Obviously, Portugal is going to be a bit different, but will follow a pretty similar pattern. And what we see is that the vast majority of animals that the average meat eater impacts are chickens. This slide is actually a little bit outdated, so I'll note that there should be a few more fish icons in this picture. It's mostly chickens and then a few fish that is the main impact for the average meat eater. In the US, which is, of course has very high meat consumption, just like Portugal, the average American consumes just about 1/2 of a pig per year, about 1/8 of a beef cow, and about 1/30 of the production of a dairy cow in terms of the quantity of their milk production. So when we think about the impact of the average person, this is what it looks like in terms of the individual animals who are impacted and what species they happen to be. And what this means is that changes in diet can have very interesting impacts on overall reduction in animal suffering and prevention of animal suffering. So if we were to say or assume that going vegan reduces 100% the direct harm to animals that comes from raising and killing animals for food, what are the other changes in diet? What's the impact that those have? So somebody who goes vegan, except for dairy, who continues to consume dairy at the same levels, they would still reduce over 99% of the amount of animal suffering, as well as over 99% of the number of animals as going entirely vegan. Someone who goes vegetarian, who still eats eggs and consumes dairy, but cuts out beef, pork, chicken, fish, and so on, will reduce about 89% of that suffering. And somebody who just cuts out fish and poultry while continuing to eat pork and beef and lamb and so on, as well as eggs and dairy, they will reduce about 84% of that total suffering. Lastly, somebody who cuts out red meat while continuing to eat chicken, fish, and so on, will only reduce about 4% of that suffering. So what does this mean for us as advocates? So when we think back to that question of what is the best request, and asking for everything we want versus just a little versus something in between, when we think about the results we saw there, where the most effective request and encouragement was encouraging people to make a behavior change that is significant, but that many people could probably picture themselves doing. If we keep that in mind, and if we keep in mind this data point about the actual impact for animals of these different dietary changes that fall on that high point of that curve, that area where it is a significant change, but it's one that people can probably picture themselves doing. I think it's important to keep those things in mind when we think about exactly what we want to encourage the public to do, what the specific behavior change we want to request is in our materials, our messaging, our conversation with friends, and so on. So in conclusion, I think probably everyone who's watching this video, you're watching it and you're attending this conference because you care about animals, you want to create a better world, a world with less animal abuse, less animal suffering, with animals treated the way that we all think that they should be treated. If we truly believe that each animal is an individual and every animal matters just as much as the other, regardless of which species they belong to. And if we also believe that what matters is not how much we care, what matters is not the purity of our actions, our messaging, what matters most is the real world outcome and how many of her are spared from a lifetime of suffering. If that's what we all believe, I certainly think it's important for us to embrace research and testing and data and have those things, rather than anything else, guide the decisions that we make. If we do that, and if we're intellectually honest about that and rigorous about that, it will enable us to be much more effective advocates. It will enable us to focus less on expressing who we are and what we want and what we believe. Rather, it'll allow us to use the messaging that is most effective at sparing the greatest number of her and the other animals like her as possible. So thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time to listen and for being part of the conference. I'll take my screen share off now and I think we have time for a little Q&A.
Thank you so much, Nick. You don't know, I don't have words to express my gratitude because I was hearing everything you're saying, and it's because of having that on mind that it's so urgent for the animals to make this change that we must be open to review all our behavior. There's this that worries me a lot, that the movement is working for decades, and the percentage of vegan and vegetarians just didn't change that much. So what have we been doing wrong, or what can we do better? And you gave us all this reliable information that it's gold before our decisions. So thank you so much for that. And let me check if we have questions. You were so explicit. Maybe everyone is only amazed. I think we have one question. No, here. No, it's here. I have to read it in another place because some people don't use the right channels, but they deserve me to read it too. So someone, it's not completely related, but maybe what is the most reliable number in terms of percentage of population to make veganism the social norm? Do you know if that's happening in some part of the world? Because I believe we are around 3, maybe a little more % in the world, but can you talk to us about the numbers that you know, if you know?
Yeah, so if the question is, so what percentage of the population would that have to get to become a social norm that then inspires a lot of other people to make that change? I don't know. I haven't seen studies that point out some specific percentage of the population that has to believe something for it to then become dramatically easier to persuade others to do the same. And certainly regardless of what level it got to, it doesn't make it inevitable that others will make the same change. So as best as I know, as best as I can tell from what I've read, it's more a gradual thing where the more that have made a certain change, the more that it will be persuasive to others to make that same change. So I don't think there's a magic number there. I think that, but I do think that any talking points we can use that make it look as if there's as much change as possible, the more effective we'll be. And that's why I think, even though the number of people who say are vegan is a very small percentage indeed, and even the say 2 or maybe 3% in some countries that might say that, the reality is far lower, because most people who say that they are not actually eating that diet all the time. But regardless, I think that given the number of people who are actually vegan is so small, I think that looking to things like trends, so say it's doubled in the past 3 years, like that sounds like a big number. Talking about how 30–40% of the public are moving in that direction, that's a big number. Pointing out famous people, celebrities, politicians, etc., because they're well known, even though they're just individuals, that also helps convey this social norm that others are doing it. So I think that the best thing we can do is not hope or wait until the number of people who are vegan gets to a certain level, but rather look for those numbers that look positive and look like a good precedent now, and emphasize those sets of numbers.
Yeah, of course, but do you know if there is some country, some place in the world that the numbers are not are amazing comparatively to the norm? Like some people talk about Israel or England or Germany, where some vegan paradises. Do you know some numbers? If there is any place that we can use as an example or something?
So the country that I've heard or seen data that has the highest numbers for vegans specifically, from what I've seen, is Israel, with some surveys reporting as high as 5% of the public stating that they are vegan. But again, even in a place like Israel, that survey doesn't reflect the reality, and that there, when other surveys have been done that drill down on, okay, have you eaten this in the past week? Have you eaten that in the past week? It's a much smaller percentage that are actually vegan. So those sort of surveys are really a better way of gauging what percentage of people identify with a certain identity and try to, a lot of the times, behave a certain way, as opposed to reflecting the percentage that are actually vegan all the time.
Yeah, okay. We have another question with really small letters, so I'm sorry. Regarding that semi-vegetarians change for health and give little value to the animal suffering approach, what would be the best strategy? I think you answered this, but maybe it's good to talk about it again. Keep turning people semi-vegetarian based on health, or work out communication to make them be more concerned about animals. Keep turning people semi-vegetarian based on health, or work out communication to make them be more concerned about animals.
Yeah, I think that the answer is probably both of those things. So a couple of thoughts there. So one is indeed that if we look at the reduction in number of animals raised and killed for food, then what would have happened had people not changed their diets? The vast majority of that reduction is coming from people reducing meat as opposed to going vegetarian or vegan. And that's mostly coming from people who are motivated by health concerns. And that's why they're eating less meat and more plant-based proteins. So I think that, yes, we definitely should, as part of the public messaging and advocacy we do, talk a lot about the health benefits of eating more plant-based foods and reducing meat and animal protein consumption. So I think that's one part of it. And we don't have to specifically encourage people to be, it's not like we need to say you should be semi-vegetarian. We just should, I think, talk about, here are the benefits of reducing the amount of meat you're eating, of eating more plant-based foods. These are the benefits of those things. So yes, I think that's quite an important part of what we can do, and will continue to create significant change. In terms of getting people to care about animals as well, and some of the additional benefits that might come from that down the line. So I didn't touch on this on my talk today, but I do in the Veganomics book, I do get into some of the research on this. There is a number of studies that have been done that show that people who shift their diet, meat reduction or vegetarian or so on, for one reason, become much more open to the other reasons that also support that diet change. So in other words, people who start eating a lot less meat for health reasons, or even go vegetarian for health reasons, they subsequently become much more open to the animal protection, environmental, and other ethical reasons, and vice versa. People who do it for animals, and like myself, later become much more open to the health benefits and so on. And so I think that for getting people to care about animals and have and stick with a plant-based diet for that reason, probably the most effective way, one potentially effective approach would be use the messaging that gets them to make the behavior change first, and then help the attitude follow. We often think we have to change the attitude and from there behavioral change, but really the focus needs to be on let's change the behavior, because that's what opens the door for attitude change, including caring about animals.
Yeah, but I think it takes some courage for advocates to rethink the strategy, because we still work too much with our hearts, and we feel the urgency emotionally, but when you really attend these numbers and all this information, then you can give all your heart to the results that we want to see, and the ability of adapting, it's the best tool, I believe, to make the movement really tap the system, don't you think?
I do. I think that the hardest thing is to be very conscious of our own motivations and what's driving our behavior. And are we being driven by the desire to express ourselves and what we want and what we believe? Or are we making decisions based on what will actually create the most real world, the most of those real world outcomes that we want, which is less animals suffering in this way? And I think that is true of this area of messaging and communication, what we ask for. It's also true in many, many other ways as well. So I think that self-awareness and trying to take out those personal motivations, like not worry about expressing what we believe, not worry about just saying what we want and what we know, and just focus on, okay, what do I want? What's the real world outcome I want? And what's the most effective way to get to that? Those are two very different approaches, and it can be hard to have the level of both self-awareness and self-discipline to focus on the latter approach.
Yeah, and to work in the solution fields, because as you said, and it's really like two fronts of work. We have people working in showing the problem, but now it's the time to work in solutions, because people already know about veganism, even old people. We can find the word everywhere. So this ability of changing, we can do it with all our hearts and put all our energy there and have best results quickly for the animals. And I just hope we can inspire advocates all over the world to make this interior reflection. And thank you so much, Nick. Let me check. I think we have a late question. I was going to end. Okay, do these data have the urgent state of climate change is considered? Okay, because the environment bar in your graphic was so low. So that data is actualizado, não é? Do this data have the urgency state of climate change considered? But can you talk us about why is that so low? Because we have this idea that now is the trends, arguments, or maybe it's changing now.
Yeah, I think it's changed some. It doesn't seem like, so I haven't kept up on the data over the past couple years as much as I had in previous years. But it is clear there's been some change. So most of the studies, all of the studies that the data in that presentation are from, that kind of goes up through around 2015-ish, 2016. And so I do agree with the spirit of the comment that I think there is definitely much more concern for the environment now. And that probably would make an environmental argument resonate notably more now than it would have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago when these previous studies were from. So yes, I do think that probably those environmental bars would be higher if the same studies were replicated today. I still imagine the general themes would be true, and that for people who are vegetarian or vegan, health and animals would still be the two primary motivations, and that for people who are eating less meat, health is still by far the primary motivation. But I do imagine that that environment bar would be notably higher on both of those. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, because in these two last years, many things changed a lot. So, but the idea passed out. Well, we are on time. It's a pity that we have to go away. I am like speechless, usually who knows me knows that I talk too much and I can't stop thinking loud, but I'm moved. So, you know, it's been difficult for me because I'm for many years fighting to open our minds, and now this is happening, and it's a very special moment for the movement in Portugal. Thank you so much for bringing all that gold information, Nick.
Well, thank you so much for your work, and everyone who's listening as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all. Agora posso falar em português. Thank you so much to everyone who is listening, but em português, muito obrigada a todos que nos acompanharam esta tarde. Eu peço desculpa porque de facto estou um pouco emotiva e não é bom momento para eu falar porque começo logo a chorar, portanto não vou fazer isso. Agora aqui na nossa última palestra vou convidar-vos a acompanhar o veganário. A sala creio que vai ficar aberta, pelo que vão poder conhecer a feira do veganário. Nós temos um álbum também na página do Facebook, onde podem passear como se passeassem pela feira e ver que projetos e que empresas é que aderiram ao desconto especial do veganário 2020, também encontram no site. Mas se a sala ficar aberta, vão estar a passar também uma forma de conhecerem quem é que aderiu e aproveitarem, porque ainda podem fazer as vossas encomendas até amanhã. Resta-nos também convidar-vos para logo à noite, que temos outra surpresa muito especial, que é o Patrick Baboumian, que para quem já conhece sabe que é também uma história muito impressionante, porque o Patrick ganhou o título de homem mais forte da Alemanha e é seguramente o vegano mais forte do mundo, e só pela sua mera existência, pelo trabalho que ele faz em si, ele combate um dos maiores mitos que existe sobre o veganismo, que é então e a proteína. E portanto o Patrick, sendo um atleta de alta competição, tem uma história muito impressionante para partilhar connosco logo à noite na primeira pessoa. Juntem-se a nós às 9 da noite e depois podem colocar diretamente também algumas perguntas, portanto se estiverem a assistir diretamente no Facebook, convido-vos a procurar o link e a entrar na sala. E até já, tenham um bom jantar. Muito obrigada por nos acompanharem. Rui, muito obrigada por fazeres também esta tradução e todas as nossas traduções, porque o teu trabalho faz de facto com que esta informação fique acessível a muitos mais de nós. E obrigada a todos. Thank you so much, Nick, again.
Thank you.